Before the 19th century, Europe was locked in a rigid hierarchy. Power was inherited, not earned. A web of hereditary monarchs and feudal lords maintained a careful, stagnant balance across the continent, ensuring the old order remained unchallenged. Then came a minor artillery officer from an impoverished Corsican family. Through sheer military competence and a series of rapid battlefield successes, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to Emperor of the French in barely a decade. His expansion shattered the continent's fragile borders. The traditional powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, were forced into a constant state of mobilization, forming coalition after coalition to try and contain a single commander. By marching his armies through the capitals of Europe, he systematically dismantled the absolute authority of the old ruling class. The engine driving this conquest was a structural military innovation, the corps system. Rather than moving as one slow, massive column, the French military was divided into self-sufficient mini-armies. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. This allowed them to advance rapidly along separate roads and feed themselves by foraging from the local countryside, eliminating the need for slow, heavy supply wagons. By spreading out, the French disguised their ultimate target. When they located the main enemy force, these widely scattered units could snap together at a single point, overwhelming paralyzed opponents at decisive engagements, like Austerlitz and Jena. But battlefield victories alone couldn't hold an empire together. The newly conquered territories required a new administrative structure. This is the Code Civil of 1803, later known as the Napoleonic Code. It stripped away a chaotic web of medieval laws and replaced them with a single, modernized legal framework applied across French-controlled Europe. He established legal equality and property rights, effectively abolishing feudalism where his armies marched. Yet this modernization was delivered at the point of a bayonet, subjecting the continent to a strict military dictatorship. While the French army dominated the land, the British Royal Navy controlled the oceans. Unable to launch a naval invasion, the French emperor implemented the Continental System, an economic blockade intended to ban British trade from all European ports. Looking at this map of Europe in 1812, you can see how far this policy stretched French resources. To close off the ports on the Iberian Peninsula, troops had to occupy Spain and Portugal, stretching supply lines thousands of miles from Paris. The rapid maneuverability of the corps system relied on forcing a swift, decisive battle, but the Spanish and Portuguese populations largely refused to engage the French on those terms. Instead, armed civilians and local militias waged a brutal campaign of ambushes and hit-and-run raids. It became known as La Guerrilla, the Little War. This created an impossible tactical loop. If the French spread out to police the countryside, they were isolated and destroyed by the insurgents. But if they massed their forces together to fight the regular British and Portuguese armies, the insurgents instantly reclaimed the abandoned territory. The very doctrine that conquered Europe was rendered useless. Over 250,000 French soldiers were tied down in a grueling war of attrition, slowly bleeding the empire's resources. Desperate to plug the remaining holes in his economic blockade, the emperor turned his sights east. In the summer of 1812, he crossed into Russian territory with over 600,000 men. This sheer scale broke his own rules of war. An army of that size could not move quickly, nor could it feed itself by foraging. It required heady supply trains that ground to a halt on Russia's poor dirt roads. Recognizing the threat, the Russian army refused to stand and fight. They initiated a scorched earth strategy. Retreating forces burned their own crops, villages, and storehouses, intentionally starving the advancing French. Long marches through extreme summer heat gave way to plummeting temperatures and a harsh winter. Deprived of shelter and food, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died from disease and freezing cold, far more effectively than in combat. Even after securing a bloody victory at Borodino and occupying a burned-out Moscow, the surrender never came. The Russian emperor simply refused to negotiate. The speed, foraging, and relentless aggression that built his empire became the mechanisms of its destruction. The destruction of the Grand Army in Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. Recognizing the vulnerability, the monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and Sweden allied with Russia and Britain for a massive counteroffensive. Outnumbered and relying heavily on young conscripts, the French were steadily pushed back across Germany. By early 1814, Allied armies marched into Paris, forcing an unconditional abdication and exile to Elba. A brief return to power culminated in his final military defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. The old powers of Europe only defeated Napoleon by finally adopting the modern, total war methods he had invented. Exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, the former emperor could only watch as victorious monarchs convened to redraw the borders of Europe, attempting to restore the old order. But the systemic reforms he forced onto the continent created centralized bureaucracies, unified legal codes, and dismantled feudalism. They could not be erased. Furthermore, his conquest had triggered an explosive unintended legacy: nationalism. By occupying European nations, he unified those populations around a shared sense of identity rather than loyalty to a local king. Napoleon was a dictator consumed by his own ambition, but his overreach served as the wrecking ball that fatally wounded the Age of Kings and accidentally birthed the modern political world.